the challenges that face our country today, a powerful message needs to go out from this Lok Sabha, the House of the People, that reason, akal, will be our only torch, justice, insaf, our only worship, and humanity, insaniyat, our only religion. As the minorities face the cold winds of exclusion from the powers that be today, it is pertinent to recall what Dr. Ambedkar said on the question of minority protection while introducing the draft constitution on November 4th, 1948. I will quote only one, the most important sentence from that historic speech. It is for the majority to realize its duty not to discriminate against minorities.
Welcome you on behalf of FPRC for this program. And I would like to begin with a question that comes to everybody's mind so far as you are concerned. You have been an academic and now you have entered another new arena, that is active politics. So are you happy with this change?
My primary identity is that of a historian and scholar. And I see myself as making a contribution to public life in India at a very crucial moment in India's political history. I have taught at Harvard in the history department since 2001. But before that, when I was at Tufts University, I used to teach in the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. In fact, in addition to Professor of History, I had a title Professor of Diplomacy. So I have made this shift and trying to contribute. I think it's very important for anyone interested in serving one's country to devote at least some part of his or her life to public service. I don't see myself as a politician. Just as Subhash Chandra Bose used to write in his passport that his occupation was that of a public servant. I see myself as a public servant as well.
Do you enjoy this change?
Enjoy is not quite the right word. I certainly found the election campaign to be an educational experience, even though I had taken part in my mother, Krishna Bose's election campaigns before, so I knew the Jadavpur constituency quite well. Let me put it this way. When I get a chance to speak in some of the major debates in Parliament, I feel that it is worthwhile. I am being able to enrich the debate on important issues facing the country. When Parliament doesn't function, I feel rather frustrated. Now, even my initial reluctance to enter politics, Mamata Banerjee had to really persuade me, even arm twist me, into contesting the Lok Sabha elections, had something to do with the fact that this is not the politics of the era of the freedom struggle. I had heard about the corruption and the criminalization that had vitiated our politics. But then I felt that some of us had to take the plunge and try to cleanse our politics, try to raise the level of our political discourse. And that is exactly what I'm trying to do in Parliament.
You have been a member of a standing committee of the Parliament on External Affairs. Not many people know about its role and its function. How does it function? I mean, what's its role? How it is useful in the business of Parliament?
I knew something about the Standing Committee on External Affairs even before I became a member, and have served on this committee for the last year and a half. The standing committees in India's Parliament were set up quite late, in the 1990s. And the first two chairpersons of the Standing Committee on External Affairs were two very distinguished people, Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Inder Kumar Gujral. And the third chairperson happens to be my mother, Krishna Bose, who was chair of the Standing Committee on External Affairs for 5 years, from 1999 to 2004. And she actually tried to make it a much more active committee. She almost tried to run it as if it were the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So I had heard about how she brought in expertise from outside government to educate and inform parliamentarians about what to do during major international crises, such as Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. So when I got the opportunity to make a choice as to which committee I should serve on, I chose the External Affairs Committee. And I have to say that even though Parliament gets disrupted, a good bit of constructive work gets to be done in the standing committees. Let me give you just one example. I think that the standing committee on which I serve played a very major role in creating a consensus on the land boundary agreement with Bangladesh. Now, here is an agreement that had not been ratified by Parliament for as many as 40 years. And so I took part in the deliberations. I made sure that there was language in the report that we adopted unanimously and presented to Parliament, which would balance the national interest, the state's interest, and also the human interest, the interest of the human beings who lived in the enclaves that were going to be exchanged. And I also made sure that the state chief minister, the chief minister of West Bengal, the state that I come from, felt comfortable that she was being consulted at the highest political level. And that meant that we were able to have this historic breakthrough. And not only was the report adopted unanimously in the standing committee, but we were able to pass a constitution amendment bill unanimously in both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. And I made a major speech on the occasion when our External Affairs Minister, Sushma Swaraj, brought that bill before Parliament.
Are the decisions always unanimous about the reports that are submitted by the...
We try to create unanimity and consensus. Sometimes there can be dissenting notes given by some members. In the case of the Indo-Bangladesh Land Boundary Agreement, we were able to achieve unanimity. Now, I do feel, though, that sometimes the work of the committee gets to be somewhat routine. Simply looking at the budgets of the departments, and it is important because we feel that the External Affairs Ministry is very underfunded. It has a budget of only 15,000 crores, which I think is too little. So we should look at all of that. But I think we should play a much more proactive role in overseeing the conduct of India's foreign policy. And this, I think, is something that some members of the External Affairs Committee can move towards, because we have some very fine members. We have Shashi Tharoor, who's chairing the committee. There's Dr. Karan Singh. I am there. The Foreign Secretary comes to depose before us. We would also like to see our Foreign Service expanded. We want to see more lateral entry from the academic world and from the private sector, which will bring a breath of fresh air to our Foreign Service. So these are all issues that we discuss in the Standing Committee, and we make our recommendations.
So that makes it a very useful forum.
Useful forum, and I think it can be made even more useful through the active engagement of several members. I know that my mother, Krishna Bose, made a major difference during those 5 years that she chaired the committee. And after that, there was a period when it was perhaps not as active and engaged. But again, at this moment, I think we have a very fine committee, and I think we can play a major role in even shaping some aspects of India's foreign policy.
Now I come to one of your statements that I think you had made about election manifestos of Indian political parties. You said that election manifestos are weak on foreign policy, and if you were given a chance, an opportunity to frame foreign policy of India, how would you spell out the various aspects of India's foreign policy?
First of all, I think by highlighting matters of foreign policy even in election manifestos, we would be signaling to our younger generation that they ought to take a more intelligent and an active interest in foreign affairs. We live in a connected world. There is nothing that happens in our country which is not influenced in one way or another by developments taking place across our borders. There have been earlier phases of globalization in world history, but this contemporary phase of globalization is characterized by a very intense web of links. And just consider the economy. However strong our economy might be, if there is a global downturn, we are going to be affected. And so we need to understand that our destiny is connected with the rest of the world. That's the most basic proposition. But also what I would like to emphasize in any document on foreign policy is that we live in the early 21st century when Asia is recovering the global position that it had lost 200 years ago in the late 18th and the early 19th century. So India must be part of the larger story of the rise of Asia. And in some ways, the biggest foreign policy challenge that we face is how to manage the simultaneous rise of China and India in a peaceful manner. The idea of Asia has been around for a very long time. Even in the early 20th century, there were many major thinkers, including our own Rabindranath Tagore, who thought about the future of Asia. But nationalist rivalries between Japan and China shattered the dream of Asian universalism. We proved to be as prone to nationalist rivalries and wars as Europe in Asia. So we must avoid those historic blunders in the early 21st century. And finally, what I would say is that India has a role to play on the global stage. Our freedom fighters, including Subhash Chandra Bose, used to say, India freed means humanity saved, or that India has to be great not just for herself, but for the contributions that we can make to the rest of the world. Now, we have to play a major role on the global stage. We are much more powerful than we were in the years just after independence. But in order to achieve our global aspirations, we have to resolve some of the problems that we have in our own region. We cannot constantly be hobbled by conflicts that we have with our neighbors. They have to be addressed, they cannot be evaded, and I think it will help us to play a role on the global stage if we can, in a very decisive way, resolve some of the problems that we have in our immediate neighborhood.
Now I come to another subject which is very dear to your heart. That is, you said once that federal spirit is dying. I mean, it's declining. India is a federal state, and that thing is missing. So far as foreign policy is concerned, India is a federal state. States have a right to voice their interests, their problems, because I think there are hardly 4 states which don't have international boundary or maritime boundary. So most of the states have this problem, and they want to be consulted when the central.
Yes, I don't believe that any state should have any kind of veto on the conduct of India's foreign policy. Even in the most federal federal systems, what we see is that foreign affairs, defense, and communications are usually within the domain of the center of the union. However, I think that in a country as diverse as India, we need to consult the states. And I think that we will have a smoother conduct of our foreign policy if we can get our states on board. And we saw it with the Indo-Bangladesh agreement. As soon as the states which have borders with Bangladesh, particularly West Bengal, felt that it had been properly consulted, we had a breakthrough and an agreement was reached. And I genuinely believe that in order to improve relations with Bangladesh, West Bengal, because of its cultural and its linguistic affiliation with what is today Bangladesh, has a very positive role to play. Just as I believe that if we are to ever improve relations with Pakistan, our Punjab will have a major role to play. Whenever I go to Punjab, I find that there is a great desire for friendship with Pakistan, with greater trade and economic engagement across the Wagah border and so on. So I think that in many instances, the states can actually play a facilitating role for the Indian Union as a whole to improve relations with our neighbors. Now, there could be some major difficulties as well, and one issue that immediately comes up is, of course, Tamil Nadu and its role in our relations with Sri Lanka. And again, I don't think that a state should have a veto on the conduct of foreign policy, but we need to take into consideration certain sentiments, certain sensitivities that our own Tamil population might have regarding the treatment of the Tamil populations in Sri Lanka. Now, even there, of course, there are completely 2 different kinds of Tamil populations. There is a very old Sri Lankan Tamil population in the north, and then there are the Indian Tamils who basically migrated to the tea plantations in the 19th century. But be that as it may, we should factor in the sensitivities and sentiments without necessarily giving the states any kind of power of veto. Let us at least try to bring them on board so that we can smoothly implement what we have in mind in terms of policy towards our neighbors. Well, there was a lot of consultation when there were these coalition governments in the latter half of the 1990s. But I think that while there might be an instinct on the part of a government which commands a majority in the Lok Sabha to act unilaterally from the center, I believe that there is a realization that states really have to be consulted and brought on board if these policies are to be successfully put into action. I think that we require more statesmanship even at the level of the states, and that's why I like what you are doing, because very often regional parties are mired in their own local and regional concerns. But we have to think of how the regional parties can come together at the federal level. We must have some kind of a coherent program at the all India level. You just mentioned how current Prime Minister, while he was Chief Minister of a state, jumped into this whole question of Sir Creek. But now that he's Prime Minister, I hope he realizes that one of the earliest agreements that he can probably clinch with Pakistan would be Sir Creek, because the two countries were so close to reaching that agreement. So similarly, I think that I represent a party which in some sense is a regional party of West Bengal. All of our members of parliament, all 34 of them, are from one state. But we are a regional party with a national perspective and an international perspective. So that even when we were discussing or responding to the External Affairs Minister's statement on the recent visit to Islamabad, two members of our party rose to ask for clarifications. So we are definitely a regional party which is not just concerned about what's going on in West Bengal. We are interested in national affairs and international affairs. And even in my maiden speech in Parliament, even though it was what I said about not asking the government not to confuse religious majoritarianism with democracy and uniformity with unity, that was quoted much more widely. I started by speaking about foreign affairs. I said that I agreed what had been stated in the President's address, that a partnership with Japan can help us build infrastructure, not only to connect different parts of India, but to connect different parts of Asia. And I'm very glad that on the most recent visit of Prime Minister Abe, very major infrastructure, deals were made. I also, of course, I want, as I said, good relations with China. Certainly very close economic ties with China. But I also suggested that we are after all a democracy. China is a one-party state, and so we should utilize the strength of our democracy in the conduct of our foreign policy.
Now we come to India's neighborhood, South Asia, which has been your favorite domain. In 2014, when the new government took office, it was said that neighbors first was the slogan. Do you think it was just a slogan or a new phrase, or was there any drastic change in India's neighborhood policy post 2014?
Well, I think that this government has been rather inconsistent in its policy towards our neighbors. I think it was a great idea to invite the SAARC leaders to the swearing-in ceremony of the new government. But I feel that certain opportunities were lost, particularly I would say in relation to Pakistan and Nepal. If you think about Pakistan, I might have understood if foreign secretary level talks had been suspended because of a major terrorist attack. But to not continue with the dialogue because of some discussion between the Pakistan High Commission and the Hurriyat leaders, which had been taking place before as well, did not make very much sense to me. I only hope that in December of 2015, the approach to Pakistan has been put back on the track. I think it was very important for our External Affairs Minister to actually go to Islamabad, both to attend the multilateral meeting, which was the Heart of Asia Istanbul process, and because I think it's with the United States basically withdrawing from Afghanistan, 14 regional countries that are part of this Heart of Asia Istanbul process are going to be quite critical. China is part of it, India is part of it, there's Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Central Asian countries, and of course the first meeting was held in Turkey. So it was important to attend that meeting, but also take the opportunity to have bilateral meetings with the Prime Minister and the Foreign Policy Advisor. And I now hope that this comprehensive bilateral dialogue will be a sustained process. So I think there were mistakes made. The start was good, then this government lost its way, and I hope that by December 2014 it's once again found its way. Think about Nepal. Foreign policy is not a matter of a spectacle. So we had a visit by the Prime Minister which was portrayed as very successful, but then what followed was a complete collapse in Indo-Nepal relations. And I think the whole process was rather poorly handled on our part. And I hope that just as in the case of Pakistan, we will somehow be able to put the approach to Pakistan sort of back on track.
There is one more aspect of India's relations with neighbor, that there are certain occasions when internal problems in a neighboring country, they put blame on India for what is happening there. It is their internal politics and internal issues with which India has nothing to do. But it has become very fashionable in some neighboring countries, not all neighboring countries, but in some neighboring countries, to blame India for what happens inside their country. So how India can be held responsible for what takes place inside those neighboring countries?
No, India cannot. But we can take it in our stride that this often happens when you have one very large country, much more powerful country, and there are basically smaller neighbors of very different sizes. And that's why I think it's important to have a generous and an imaginative foreign policy towards all our neighbors. Now, I am not so sure that it's the internal troubles or disturbances in these countries that should concern us most, or the fact that we are sometimes blamed for them needlessly and wrongly. What I would say is that we have to understand the nature of the state in each of these countries. And therefore, while I do think that we ought to be generous and imaginative to all of our neighbors, we really have to understand that Pakistan is a state which is dominated by the military. Even after the transition to civilian rule and democracy in the form of elections. And therefore, we have to be somewhat cautious in our approach, understand that it's an unelected institution, the military, which is dominant within Pakistan's state structure. And knowing that, we have to move forward with our dialogue. Similarly, I think, let us say in the case of Sri Lanka, we have to understand that Sinhala Buddhist majoritarianism has had a much longer history and a more sort of potent history than, let us say, Hindu majoritarianism in our country. And we have to understand that. But most importantly, I think at this stage, we have to figure out what we do when China is playing such a very major role within our neighborhood. Think about the ports that they have been building in our neighboring countries, Gwadar in Balochistan, in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and so on. And now, of course, there comes the very major challenge of Pakistan's roads that are going to be built. Now, China has a much bigger vision. They are calling it One Belt, One Road. And they want to connect the Eurasian landmass, and they also want to have a maritime Silk Route, and they are investing heavily in connectivity based on infrastructure. But China also, from April 2015, has undertaken a major initiative in Pakistan. When President Xi Jinping came to Pakistan, he basically actually allocated a very large sum of money to build 2 roads through Pakistan. Initially, it was just going to be a western road through Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan. Now we hear, partly because I think the Sharif brothers are very powerful in the government, that there's going to be an eastern alignment through Punjab, coming all the way to Lahore. Now, we have to see what we do in terms of utilizing this kind of connectivity infrastructure, what kinds of connectivity we can actually sponsor and build. We may have lost a little bit of time. You know, I wrote a book on the history of the Indian Ocean, which came out in 2006, 100 Horizons. And I feel that we may have had a comparative advantage in playing a bigger role in building the maritime route. But we lost some time. The Indian Ocean Initiative, of which South Africa was a part and Indonesia was a part and India was playing a role, that didn't really get off the ground. But even so, I believe that we can actually project a combination of hard power and soft power. And I think India has a comparative advantage in terms of its soft power potential all across the Indian Ocean world. And that's how we need to respond to the challenge being presented by China.
So now we come to another major power, that is United States. Very often it is said, and Indians are very vocal about that US doesn't ask Pakistan to curb terrorism and terrorist activities from its own borders and all that. So do you think that we as Indians are a little, not very happy with this situation? Why can't US pressurize Pakistan to come to terms so far as this anti-terrorism steps are concerned and cooperate with India? This is, popular feeling in India that the US is not doing enough to pressurize Pakistan so far as its relations, particularly those terrorist activities are concerned.
Of course, the United the United States, of course, constantly tells Pakistan to do more in the battle against terrorism. But I think we have to place this feeling, as you say, we have in the context of a very long-term relationship between the United States and Pakistan. After all, these two countries were Cold War allies, and then of course they were allies during the war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan for a very crucial period from 1979 up to the late 1980s. That's when the real transformation of Pakistan took place, with a kind of state-sponsored Islamization. And the United States contributed during that decade to the problems that came back to haunt them later. But the United States also just abandoned Pakistan for about 10 years during the 1990s, and then got re-engaged once 9/11 happened in 2001. So in Pakistan, I think there is a sense that the United States has been a rather unreliable ally. Now, from our perspective, if it is indeed the fact that the United States doesn't do quite enough to get Pakistan to curb terrorism from being conducted on its soil and from there, then in some ways we probably need to engage Pakistan directly on this question. And I think that is beginning to happen. And again, as I said, we have to be cautious, and we have to wait and watch. I think that Pakistan may have reached a turning point in December of 2014, when there was that terrible attack on the school in the Northwest Frontier province, now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in Peshawar. And we have to be very observant and see if Pakistan has indeed entered a post-jihadi moment. Because this was an army school, and there were these children of army officers who were massacred. And since then, at least when it comes to certain terrorist groups, even the Pakistani military has been taking action. And so, there is a school of opinion in Pakistan as well, which feels that terrorism is a scourge for Pakistani society, quite as much for us. And we have to see whether one can take advantage of that feeling to move decisively to curb terrorism being conducted from Pakistani soil. I think it would be a mistake on our part to depend wholly on the United States, whose influence in fact may be limited as it also withdraws from the region and from Afghanistan and so forth. And therefore we have to learn how to look after our own interests. And that's why, while it's important, I think, to take part in the various military exercises even that we conduct these days with the United States and Japan, I think they are very important, because we want a multipolar Asia, not one dominant power in Asia. Yet, I think at the same time, without thinking that somehow the United States will help us in these matters, we need to directly engage China and Pakistan through our bilateral diplomatic efforts.
One more question about talks with Pakistan. Recently, there has been a new phrase given to this bilateral talks. People in India often ask a question: talks for talk's sake? How long we will go on talking, and nothing substantial will come out of these talks? I mean, people are impatient that the talk should produce some tangible results, some concrete results. But talks after talks, sometimes talks don't take place. Even if talks take place, nothing substantial comes out. So people say that should we talk to Pakistan at all? Should we carry on the dialogue indefinitely, uncertainly?
It is not a question of talking for the just sake of talking, but I think that being engaged in dialogue with a neighbor, which also happens to be a nuclear power, is absolutely imperative. You may be right that there are no concrete results that seem to come out of these talks, but there might even be a certain negative value of hostilities being brought down to manageable levels and so forth, even during periods when there appear to be no tangible results. But I do hope that now that this comprehensive bilateral dialogue will sort of take place, I think it would be important to try and achieve some results fairly quickly. I think there are some low-hanging fruits there. There were a couple of agreements that we were very close to signing.
They were in the pipeline.
And therefore, I think it would be important for both India and Pakistan to show that we can deliver and have some results for us to show to the people of the subcontinent. Sometimes there are talks that go on for very long, even in terms of some of our internal troubles. These Naga talks had been going on forever. And people wonder, why don't we come to some kind of a resolution. But by and large, I would say that talking is better than not talking at all. Of course, like most people in India, I would prefer to see some tangible results within a reasonable time frame. But there are certain problems that don't admit of easy solutions, even though I think it's very important to believe that even the Kashmir problem is resolvable. If Britain and Ireland could come together and have an agreement on the Irish question, it is not beyond the realm of possibility for India and Pakistan, but also involving the people of Kashmir to come to a reasonable solution. And as a historian, I've often argued that on the question of sovereignty and frontiers, we in the past had much more enlightened ideas than what we borrowed from Europe, the Westphalian notions of unitary sovereignty. So if we draw on the best in our own political thought, we might be able to make some headway in resolving even some problems that might look intractable. That is the minimum that we can expect. But I think that we owe something bigger to the people of the subcontinent. Because after all, we are a subcontinent still mired in poverty. I was just reading the Human Development Report, the latest one that has just been issued. And all of us, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, we are ranked so low. And what really was most upsetting to me as I read the latest Human Development Report is that on most indicators of gender inequality, we in India are doing worse than Bangladesh and Pakistan. Now, if we can actually achieve peace, if we can have a genuine peace dividend, and if we can then focus our attention on eradicating poverty, having genuine inclusive development, then I think, a successful foreign policy initiative can be a great boon to us domestically. And that is what we owe to our people.
Just last first question, I will take a lot of your time. What will be your message to the people who use social media network to express their views about India's foreign policy? It has been seen that very frequently they are very sentimental about the issues.
I am not the best person to comment on social media, because here I am, even in public life now, without being on either Facebook or Twitter. But I'm vicariously on social media because I have been teaching students for more than 3 decades, and whenever I make a speech, I hear that I'm all over social media. Students, the younger generation, who tell me that on Twitter and WhatsApp, who are on social media, should recognize that policymakers, particularly in the domain of foreign affairs, are dealing with very weighty matters of war and peace, of life and death, and therefore they often, have to consider matters very carefully. And sometimes, you cannot actually make a pronouncement which is in a very brief sort of kind of a message that fully captures the complexity of what we have to deal with. So I would certainly advise some patience, but also I'm all in favor of free expression. But I think that people should understand that we have to work for peace, because peace will be the basis of our development, which we all want. And finally, that development will actually enable us to play a global role, to be the 21st century power that actually influences the kind of world that we want to live in.
Thank you, Professor Bose. I'm really grateful to you for sparing time and expressing your views on a very pertinent subject, which are sometimes very controversial also, but you have been very frank, and we hope the viewers will be able to understand the implications of various issues that you have pointed out. Thank you.